perhaps before we get started, maybe you can give some the initial analysis and on the latest development of China-U.S. relations, particularly how you view this recent President Xi and President Biden virtual summit, and what's your general take of this current U.S.-China relation? Since you are such a great expert on the U.S.-China relations.
Well, I think the first thing to say is that, in a way, we're in the most unprecedented time in U.S.-China relations, perhaps since Nixon went to China in 1972. And the mere fact that our relationship right now is in an unprecedented situation, I think means there are no experts. This is a situation that we haven't confronted in a long time. And so, to borrow a phrase from Deng Xiaoping, I think both sides are feeling their way across the river by feeling the stones. So I think we are engaged in a kind of incremental, step-by-step attempt to understand how we can manage this relationship in a far different environment. And that environment is different from what we dealt with for the last 40 years in several respects. And one is that, of course, China has made enormous strides in its economic power and its capacity to shape the regional economic architecture and infrastructure. And of course, military power relationship has fundamentally changed. And so it's quite natural to say we are really confronting an unprecedented situation. I think President Xi, and I can't speak for President Biden for sure, but I think they would both agree that our principal need at the current time is to avoid what was called, I think President Xi said, catastrophic mistakes. So if we ask, is the big danger catastrophic mistakes, and then talk about the Xi-Biden virtual meeting of last week, I think that meeting somewhat gives me more confidence that there is a will to manage this relationship on both sides. So I think I'm a little more confident of our ability to manage things for the next period of time than I was. But I would want to emphasize that I think we have not fundamentally addressed the major issues, or much less resolved them, that are creating the problems. If you think about it, for the last 40 years, our growing economic relationship was a positive factor in the relationship. Now economics is a very contentious part. And though we had an agreement between the United States and China under President Trump in 2020, quite frankly, that trade and economic agreement was not lived up to. We still have tariffs that resulted after there had been hope with the new administration here in Washington, we might ease up on tariffs. So I would say no fundamental progress on the economic side. On the, let us say, military and security side, I thought the fact that they talked a little about, as I would understand, arms control, from an American point of view, I think, without speaking for our government, that when we now for the first time might be able to talk meaningfully about arms control, at least in a limited sense, I take that to be positive. And the sense I got from the virtual summit that our military to military may engage more seriously with each other in dialogue. If that happens, I think that's good. But fundamentally, we're in an arms race, and this virtual summit did not stop it. And it has quite a momentum in both our societies because a lot of budgets involved, perceptions of threat on both sides are involved, and technology has a logic of its own. So I would say the two big drivers of U.S.-China relations, economics and strategic security issues, the virtual summit, as far as I can see, did not really address them. So just to summarize, I think it's better to talk than not to talk. I'm glad we're talking. I think that's certainly the first step to make progress. But frankly, I didn't see very much progress.
Thank you, David. I think you made quite unique analysis. Actually, you mentioned this dialogue is important, and also that that helps to create some atmosphere for further dialogues. I think that's certainly important. China is what it is, and giving its 5,000 history and its logic, development, and all those aspects. Perhaps the two countries can really think about the framework, how they can peacefully live together. Like President Xi said, respect to each other, peacefully coexisting, and try to be win-win. So what do you think about that? Does President Trump sound a little? Biden sounds a little different than the previous.
There have been some changes, you might say, in the implementation of that policy. And I don't think I heard him say that he was going to change implementation that much. Maybe I missed that. Mm-hmm. So I would say, yes, those are positive words, but I don't think they represent much change. And if you think about it, and it should be clear from what I've said, I certainly don't propose to speak for the U.S. government or the Biden administration, but we have the Summit of Democracies coming up. That's a high priority for President Biden. And he's talked about the global situation as, in a sense, a struggle between autocracies and democracies. And usually he mentions that China is a principal concern in that regard. So I see a bit more ideological content to a Biden administration, certainly than the Obama administration that he was vice president in. Trump, frankly, was all over the lot, wasn't consistent, and I took a grain of salt on a lot of things he had to say. You're right that he tried to implement a policy of not permitting the 98 million members of the Communist Party to come to here. I never understood how we would even know in many cases the status of individuals coming. So I didn't take terribly seriously a lot that President Trump had to say, but he was president and he did have levers of power, and occasionally he did do things that had a real impact. So, but long and the short of it is, I don't think any of the friendly statements I heard there fundamentally changed the relationship. I think it provided avenues to talk about the real problems, and I hope we will seize this opportunity. I think in a way it maybe, I don't want to quite say stabilized our relationship, but at least it made it less fragile, I think, and gives us a little time to operate.
That's why I was thinking that President Biden's side not going to change in China is maybe give some credit to this system, because if China is everything is a bad decision, how can China, leave 800 million people out of poverty or really build the, best probably infrastructure in the world? I mean, the KPI doesn't really substantiate that. So this kind of two camps on democracy or non-democracy, really, it's another way U.S. is still trying to do things like that. Which I think a lot of Chinese people are really confused.
I think you used the phrase, will President Biden give credit for consultative democracy? And I think the short answer to that question in terms of what I would anticipate him to do would be, no, he's not going to do that. And then you would ask yourself, well, why? And I think this gets to the fundamental dilemma of our relationship. And it's equally true in Beijing and China more broadly, and in Washington and the United States. And that is the political calendar in both of our countries does not make being reasonable, conciliatory, and flexible very easy to do for either leader. Of course, Xi Jinping just had the sixth plenum, and by my reading it from his point of view, and was achieved what he wanted to achieve. But there is no reward in Chinese politics for being very flexible with the Americans. And if you look ahead to the 20th Party Congress coming up next year, it's going to be very difficult for, I would say, any Chinese leader, but I would think this is true with the current Chinese leadership, to be too flexible in the documents of the six-party plenum. And there was a lot of concern about subversion from the U.S. And its activities in Hong Kong and elsewhere. So I would say the level of suspicion in China of the U.S. has not been diminished, and the domestic political situation in China does not reward leaders for being flexible and accommodating to the United States. And by the same token, it's at least as true in the United States. Next year, we have congressional elections that will dictate, or the results of which will dictate who controls both houses of Congress. And of course, that's why Biden is so desperate or anxious to get his legislation passed now, because he can't be sure he'll have a Congress that will pass it after the elections next year. And frankly, he either has to use his capital to pass legislation on infrastructure and building more social equity in the U.S. He doesn't want to spend his capital saying nice things about China that are going to be criticized. And then, of course, when we're past the 22 elections for Congress, we're going to be then into a campaign for the next president. And leave it aside whether Mr. Trump will be a major force in U.S. politics and maybe a candidate, and I think both of those things are possible. The spirit of populism and what you might call Trumpism is very strong here in the United States. So all I'm saying is the domestic political environment in both our countries does not encourage either leader to be seen as weak by their respective publics. So that it's this concatenation of domestic inflexibility, nationalism in both our countries, exaggeration, rumor, and then, of course, the power relationship and the economic relationship is changing.
I think your analysis really brought up this question about deglobalization, and nationalism, populism is running high, probably in the United States and probably also in China. So that is really not good for the leaders to really have a deep dialogue and facing its own challenge. For example, you're right. President Biden is having this midterm election coming up of the Congress, and then on the Senate they barely just have one more seat with the Vice President Harris there. So the dynamic can change. Also, they are losing a seat in the Virginia governor race recently to the Republicans. So that's exactly the dilemma we are facing. So I'm thinking of U.S. China of course have its own path of development. China basically is living in the world of democracy. U.S. probably is the largest opposition party. You got got to be watched by all the countries and things like that. But China also have a domestic, they have a market. I would refer that as a market democracy or technology democracy. 1 billion smartphone users actually can decide what they do on a daily basis, voting every day. So somehow, I think this internal energy and synergy will continue.
I was just going to say, you've mentioned a couple of times technology, and I mentioned that I thought part of the problem we've got is a technological race. And part of that technology race is over economic dominance and control, or at least success within the future industries. And I think just give one example, artificial intelligence. Now we have the capacity to delegate decisions within militaries to essentially machines. We have machines now with logarithms to determine what phrases will be selected for advertisements, for political advertisements, for propaganda. And the purpose of many of these mechanisms to select thought and exaggerate conflict. They exaggerate conflict within our own societies and between societies. So I think one of the new elements in our relationship is this technological race. It's partly for economic dominance, but technology has its own logic. And part of that logic seems to be to increase conflict. And also the delegation of military decisions to machines, I think, is a very dangerous trend that we have to be mindful of. So I think one of the new aspects here is technology. And how are we going to, as two countries, come together to cooperate to make sure that, so to speak, it's man running the machines and not the machines running man?
Yeah, right. I absolutely. I think that really, as I recall, it's really start from probably President Trump that he's really starting to really decouple and banning the use of companies like Huawei or ZTE, and then we see a host of companies being put on the list during the Trump administration. That kind of a decoupling in technology actually already happened somehow. And also that forced China to develop on its own now. So it's really not healthy. I think we use the technology to conquer, the universe and then everything, but not really into a arms race or military competition. So that's not really great.
I'm not sure most Americans would agree with that, but the way I would put it is that because there is this decoupling going on, and in China, just like in the sense of the US, there's talk of self-reliance, because when you have security problems with a country, you want to depend on them for strategic items, whether it's food or machinery, high-tech machinery, or whatever. So that, but I think the United States sees China as increasing the state enterprise sector, because that's where some of your most advanced, but not all your most advanced firms are. And so I think the American storyline is China's increasing state control of key aspects of the economy, particularly in the security area. And therefore, the United States uses that as a justification to clamp down on exports of certain goods to China. It's working with Taiwan for a big investment in computer chips in the American Southwest. In other words, we're each responding by creating our own independent economic and technological subsystems.